Picture this. You're a black traveler driving through the Midwest in 1950. The sun is setting. You see a sign at the edge of a small town. It reads, "Nigger, don't let the sun set on you here." You keep driving. You don't stop for gas. You don't stop for food. You don't even slow down. Because if you're caught in that town after dark, the police might arrest you. Or worse, a mob might find you first. This wasn't happening in one town or 10 towns. We're talking about thousands of towns across America that operated this way for decades. They called them Sundown towns, and they existed in nearly every state north of the Mason-Dixon line. Most people think racial segregation was a Southern problem, but the truth is, the most rigidly segregated communities in 20th century America were often in places like Illinois, Indiana, Oregon, and California. These weren't just unwritten rules. Many towns passed actual laws. They posted signs. They had police enforce curfews specifically targeting black residents and visitors. And when the law didn't do the job, white mobs took matters into their own hands. The goal was simple and brutal: create all-white communities through intimidation, expulsion, and violence. And it worked. Some of these towns remained over 99% white well into the 2000s, not by accident, but because the threat lingered in collective memory long after the signs came down. This is the story of sundown towns, one of the most widespread and least discussed aspects of American racial history, and it's time we talked about it. The term sundown town comes from the explicit warnings given to black people: leave before sunset or face the consequences. But the phenomenon itself emerged gradually in the decades following the Civil War. During the Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, black Americans briefly experienced unprecedented freedom and political power in the South. But when federal troops withdrew and Reconstruction ended, Southern states implemented Jim Crow laws that created a formal system of segregation and disenfranchisement. The North took a different approach. Northern states didn't have the same plantation economy or the same proportion of black residents. Many white Northerners viewed themselves as more progressive than Southerners, but they had no interest in living alongside black people as equals. So instead of creating segregated spaces within towns, they created entirely segregated towns. If the South's motto was separate but equal, the North's unspoken policy was often separate by exclusion. The first sundown towns appeared in the 1890s. The pattern was usually the same. A town that had a small black population, maybe a few dozen families, would experience some kind of incident. Sometimes it was an actual crime, sometimes just a rumor or accusation. White residents would hold meetings. Newspapers would publish inflammatory editorials. Then came the violence. In Pierce City, Missouri, in 1901, a white woman was murdered. 3 black men were accused, though no trial ever established their guilt. White mobs lynched 2 of the accused men and burned them. Then the mob turned on the entire black community. Over the next week, white residents systematically drove out every single black person in Pierce City, roughly 300 people. They burned homes. They threatened anyone who sheltered black refugees. Within days, Pierce City went from having a small but established black population to having none at all. And it stayed that way for decades. This became the template. Between 1890 and 1940, hundreds of towns across America followed Pierce City's example. In Indiana, towns like Martinsville, Elwood, and Huntington expelled their black residents through orchestrated campaigns of terror. In Illinois, Anna became so notorious that people said the town's name stood for "Ain't No Niggers Allowed." Towns in Oregon, from Grants Pass to Medford, openly advertised themselves as white-only communities. The methods varied, but the message was consistent. Some towns passed ordinances making it illegal for black people to own property or rent homes. These laws were often struck down by courts, but by the time that happened, the damage was done. Black families had already left, and word had spread. Don't go to that town. Other places used employment restrictions, refusing to hire black workers or pressuring employers who did. Still others relied on pure intimidation, rocks through windows, threats from police, or the ever-present possibility of mob violence. Vigilance committees formed in many sundown towns. These were groups of white residents who took it upon themselves to enforce the color line. If a black person was seen in town after dark, the committee would confront them. Sometimes they'd just threaten. Sometimes they'd beat them. Sometimes they'd run them out of town entirely. And crucially, local police almost never intervened to protect black victims. In fact, police were often part of the enforcement mechanism. Signs appeared at town borders throughout the first half of the 20th century. The wording varied, but the message was unmistakable. "Nigger, don't let the sun set on you here. Whites only within city limits." Some signs were more bureaucratic, citing municipal ordinances that supposedly justified the exclusion. Others were blunt threats of violence. These signs served multiple purposes. They warned black travelers. They announced to white residents that their town was protected. And they sent a message to neighboring communities about the town's racial stance. Not every sundown town had visible signs. Many operated through what researchers call unwritten rules. Everyone in the community understood the policy, even if it wasn't codified in law or posted on a sign. Black people knew which towns were safe and which weren't. This information spread through black communities via word of mouth, through black newspapers, and eventually through publications like the Negro Motorist Green book, which listed safe places for black travelers to eat, sleep, and get gas. The Green Book, published from 1936 to 1966, was essential reading for any black person traveling through America. It didn't just list welcoming establishments. It also warned travelers away from dangerous areas. The existence of the Green Book itself is evidence of how widespread and threatening sundown towns were. Black Americans couldn't just drive where they wanted and stop when they were tired. They had to plan routes carefully, knowing that a wrong turn or a breakdown in the wrong place could be deadly. The Midwest was particularly saturated with sundown towns. Illinois had more than any other state, possibly over 500 at the peak. But they existed everywhere. Oregon's Constitution until 1926 actually banned black people from living in the state at all. Even after that provision was repealed, many Oregon towns maintained exclusionary policies through the mid-20th century. California had dozens of sundown suburbs, particularly in Southern California around Los Angeles. And northern states from New York to Washington had pockets of communities that enforced racial exclusion. What's striking is how ordinary this seemed to white Americans at the time. Sundown policies were openly discussed in newspapers. Town boosters advertised their communities as white-only in promotional materials. Real estate agents explicitly marketed homes as being in all-white areas. The 1933 Appraiser's Handbook, used by the Federal Housing Administration, warned against inharmonious racial groups and advocated for neighborhood homogeneity. This federal policy effectively encouraged sundown suburbs by making it nearly impossible for black families to get mortgages in white areas. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, through their lending policies, subsidized white flight and suburban development after World War II. The new suburbs springing up around major cities in the 1940s and 1950s were often sundown towns from day one. Levittown, New York, one of the most famous planned suburbs, explicitly refused to sell homes to black families. Developer William Levitt said that bringing black families in would cause property values to collapse. He wasn't alone in this belief. It was standard practice in suburban development, restrictive covenants, legal agreements written into property deeds, formalized this exclusion. These covenants prohibited owners from selling or renting to anyone who wasn't white. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley v. Kramer that such covenants couldn't be enforced by courts, but the decision didn't eliminate them. Many remained in deeds for decades afterward, and their existence signaled to black buyers that they weren't welcome. Even more importantly, real estate agents continued to practice steering, showing black clients only properties in certain neighborhoods while directing white clients away from those same areas. Life in a sundown town created a particular kind of racial anxiety for black Americans. If you worked in a sundown town but couldn't live there, you had to time your departure carefully every single day. If you got off work after sunset, you were taking a risk. If your car broke down, you were in danger. If you had to drive through a sundown town to get somewhere else, you couldn't stop, even in an emergency. There are countless stories of black travelers being run out of towns, arrested on trumped-up charges, or beaten by police or mobs. In Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, white mobs expelled the entire black population of roughly 1,100 people after a white woman was assaulted. The county remained nearly all white for 75 years. When civil rights marchers tried to walk through Forsyth County in 1987, they were met by thousands of white counter-protesters throwing rocks and bottles. That's how deep the exclusion ran and how long it lasted. The violence wasn't always overt or immediate. Sometimes it was structural. If a black family somehow managed to move into a sundown town, they'd face economic sabotage. White-owned businesses wouldn't serve them. Employers would fire them. Their children would be harassed at school. Eventually, the family would leave, not because of a single violent incident, but because life had been made systematically unbearable. Sundown towns created what researchers call racial geographies. Entire regions developed reputations. Black Americans in the mid-20th century knew that southern Illinois was dangerous. They knew that rural Oregon was hostile. They knew that certain suburbs of Detroit or Chicago or Los Angeles were off-limits. This knowledge shaped everything from where people looked for work to what roads they took on road trips. It limited economic opportunity, educational access, and freedom of movement. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s challenged sundown towns. But progress was uneven. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in public accommodations, but it didn't address residential segregation directly. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in housing sales and rentals, but enforcement was weak and loopholes were plentiful. More importantly, by 1968, the patterns were already set. Generations of black families had learned which places were safe and which weren't. Even after the legal barriers fell, the psychological and social barriers remained. Many sundown towns never had a dramatic moment of change. The signs came down, often quietly and without fanfare. Laws were repealed or simply stopped being enforced, but the demographics barely shifted. If you look at census data for many former sundown towns, you'll see that they remained overwhelmingly white through the 1980s, the 1990s, and even into the 2000s. Some still are today. Why did this happen? Part of it is simple inertia. Black families had learned for generations that certain places weren't safe. That knowledge doesn't disappear overnight just because a law changes. Part of it is continued informal discrimination. Real estate agents might not openly refuse to show homes to black buyers, but they can subtly discourage them. White residents might not form mobs anymore, but they can make their disapproval known in other ways. And part of it is economic. Decades of exclusion meant that wealth couldn't accumulate in black communities the way it did in white ones. Even when legal barriers fell, economic barriers remained. The legacy of sundown towns is visible in American geography today. If you look at a map of the United States showing racial demographics by county, you'll see huge swaths of the country that are still over 95% white. Some of this is due to simple population distribution, but much of it traces directly back to sundown policies. These weren't accidents of migration or preference. They were the result of deliberate, systematic exclusion enforced through law, custom, and violence. The psychological impact is harder to measure, but no less real. Growing up in America as a black person meant learning which spaces were safe and which weren't. It meant understanding that your freedom of movement was constrained in ways that white Americans never had to think about. It meant knowing that certain towns, certain neighborhoods, certain roads were dangerous simply because of the color of your skin. That knowledge shapes how people navigate the world even today. There's also the economic impact. Home ownership is the primary way American families build wealth. When black families were systematically excluded from buying homes in thousands of communities for decades, they lost out on generations of wealth accumulation. When they were confined to certain neighborhoods that were then redlined and denied investment, property values in those areas stagnated or fell. The racial wealth gap in America today, where the median white family has roughly 10 times the wealth of the median black family, can be traced in significant part to housing discrimination, including sundown town policies. Education was affected too. Schools are typically funded by local property taxes. When black families were excluded from wealthier communities, their children ended up in underfunded schools. When integration finally came, it was often met with white flight. White families moved to suburbs, often former sundown towns or new developments with similar exclusionary practices. The result was that integration often didn't happen, or happened only briefly, before resegregation set in. Some towns have begun to reckon with their sundown past, but it's rare and recent. In 2020, the mayor of Goshen, Indiana, publicly acknowledged the city's history as a sundown town and apologized. In Anna, Illinois, local historians have worked to document and educate about the town's racist past, but many more towns remain silent. There are no historical markers, no museum exhibits, no acknowledgement at all. Residents, particularly white residents, often deny that their town was ever a sundown town, even in the face of documentary evidence. This denial matters because it prevents healing and prevents understanding. When communities don't acknowledge their history, they can't fully confront how that history still shapes the present. They can't have honest conversations about why their town is still 99% white, or why black visitors still sometimes report feeling unwelcome, or why certain inequalities persist. There's also a broader historical amnesia at work. Most Americans, if they know about sundown towns at all, think of them as a Southern phenomenon or an aberration, a few extreme cases. The reality is that they were widespread, normal, and accepted by mainstream white society for much of the 20th century. They were part of the fabric of American life, particularly in the North and West. Understanding this changes how we think about American history. The standard narrative of race in America goes something like this. Slavery existed in the South until the Civil War. After the war, the South created Jim Crow segregation, while the North was more progressive. The civil rights movement of the 1960s ended legal segregation, and since then, we've been gradually becoming more equal. But the reality of sundown towns complicates this story significantly. The North wasn't more progressive. It was often more exclusionary. Segregation wasn't just about separating races within shared spaces. It was about total exclusion from entire communities. And the civil rights movement's legal victories, while crucial, didn't immediately translate to integrated communities. Researcher James Loewen spent years documenting sundown towns. His book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, identified thousands of communities that practiced racial exclusion. Loewen's research relied on census data, newspaper archives, interviews with residents, and the presence of warning signs. He found that sundown towns existed in every region of the country, in small rural villages, and in wealthy suburbs. The practice peaked between 1890 and 1940, but persisted in many places well beyond that. Loewen's work showed that sundown towns weren't just a historical curiosity. They shaped the racial geography of contemporary America. The suburbs that grew explosively after World War II were often built on sundown principles. The white flight that hollowed out many American cities in the second half of the 20th century often led to sundown suburbs. The persistent residential segregation that characterizes American metropolitan areas today has roots in these exclusionary practices. What makes sundown towns particularly insidious is that they operated largely outside the formal legal system of Jim Crow. In the South, segregation was codified in law. You could point to statutes that mandated separate facilities, prohibited intermarriage, and restricted voting rights. These laws were wrong and unjust, but they were visible. They could be challenged in court and eventually overturned. Sundown towns operated differently. Many had no formal laws. The exclusion was enforced through custom, through violence, through economic pressure. There was often nothing to challenge in court because there was no official policy. This made sundown towns harder to fight and harder to remember. The economic motivations behind sundown towns are worth examining. White residents often justified exclusion by claiming it protected property values. They argued that racial diversity would lead to neighborhood decline and falling home prices. This became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When black families did move into previously white areas, white families often fled, sometimes encouraged by unscrupulous real estate agents practicing blockbusting. The resulting rapid turnover and economic disruption seemed to confirm the original fear, even though the disruption was caused by white flight, not by black residents. Labor competition also played a role. In some towns, white workers saw black workers as economic threats. By excluding black residents, they eliminated competition for jobs and housing. Unions, which should have been advocating for all workers, sometimes supported exclusionary policies. This divided the working class along racial lines and weakened labor's overall bargaining power, but it gave white workers a psychological wage of racial superiority. There were also social and psychological factors. Many white Americans simply didn't want to live near black people. They'd been taught that black people were inferior, dangerous, or undesirable. They wanted to create communities where they wouldn't have to encounter black people in daily life. Sundown towns let them do that. It was segregation by elimination rather than by separation. Some sundown towns developed elaborate mythologies to justify their whiteness. They claim that black people just didn't want to live there, or that there was no discrimination. It was just that no black families had ever tried to move in. These stories conveniently ignored the history of expulsions and violence that had created the all-white community in the first place. They allowed white residents to benefit from racial exclusion while denying they were racist. The role of local government in maintaining sundown towns can't be overstated. Police enforced curfews and vagrancy laws selectively against black people. City councils passed zoning ordinances that just happened to exclude black residents. Mayors and town councils refused to investigate violence against black people or punish those responsible. This wasn't a failure of government. It was government working exactly as it was designed to work in those communities, to maintain racial hierarchy and exclusion. Schools in sundown towns deserve particular attention. When a town successfully excluded all black residents, its schools were automatically segregated. This avoided the contentious battles over school integration that erupted in other places. But it also meant that white children in sundown towns grew up in an entirely white environment. They never had black classmates, black teachers, or black neighbors. This shaped their understanding of race in America in profound ways. Many grew up believing that racial segregation was natural and normal, not the result of deliberate policy and violence. The experience of black workers who had to commute through or work in sundown towns is harrowing. Imagine having a job in a sundown town. You arrive in the morning, work all day, and then have to make sure you leave before dark. If you work late, you're breaking the rules and risking arrest or violence. If your car breaks down, you're in serious danger. You can't stop for dinner. You can't socialize with coworkers after hours. You're constantly watching the clock, calculating how much time you have before sunset. Some black workers dealt with this by forming carpools, traveling in groups for safety. Others simply refused jobs in sundown towns, even if the pay was better, because the risk wasn't worth it. This limited employment opportunities and forced black workers into longer commutes or lower-paying jobs. It was yet another way that sundown policies imposed economic costs on black communities. The interstate highway system, built in the 1950s and 1960s, changed the dynamics of sundown towns somewhat. Highways allowed travelers to bypass small towns entirely. You could drive from one city to another without stopping in the small, potentially dangerous towns in between. But highways also sometimes reinforced segregation by cutting through black neighborhoods and cities, destroying communities and making it easier for white suburbanites to commute without interacting with black residents. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, some sundown towns began to change, but often reluctantly and only under pressure. Federal legislation, court decisions, and changing national attitudes gradually made overt racial exclusion less acceptable. But the transition was slow and uneven. Some towns integrated peacefully, others resisted fiercely, and many found ways to maintain de facto segregation even after de jure segregation became illegal. One strategy was economic exclusion. Instead of openly banning black residents, towns could simply make sure there was no affordable housing. If every home cost $500,000 and discriminatory lending practices made it nearly impossible for black families to get mortgages, the result was the same as an explicit ban, but it was harder to challenge legally. This approach was particularly common in wealthy suburbs. Another strategy was police harassment. Black people who moved into formerly sundown towns sometimes found themselves constantly stopped by police, questioned, and subjected to scrutiny that white residents never experienced. This wasn't always coordinated or official policy. Sometimes it was individual officers acting on their own prejudices, but the effect was to make black residents feel unwelcome and unsafe. Social ostracism was another tool. Black families in overwhelmingly white towns often found themselves isolated. White neighbors wouldn't socialize with them. Their children were excluded from playgroups and birthday parties. White-owned businesses might refuse service or provide poor service. Over time, this social exclusion could be as effective as legal exclusion in driving families away. The persistence of sundown towns into recent decades is startling. In 1990, there were still towns in the United States that had populations of 10,000 or more and were over 99% white, not because of demographic accident, but because of continued exclusion. Some of these towns had never had more than a handful of black residents in their entire history. Census after census showed the same pattern, all white, or near enough to make no difference. This wasn't just in rural areas. Suburbs of major cities remained virtually all white well into the 21st century. Even as the country overall became more diverse, these communities held onto their racial homogeneity. The mechanisms had changed. There were no more signs, no more explicit laws, but the result was the same. The Internet age has brought new attention to sundown towns. Black travelers now share experiences online, warning each other about places that are still hostile. There are websites and social media groups dedicated to documenting which towns feel safe and which don't. In some ways, this is a digital version of the Green Book, updated for a new century, but serving the same basic function, helping black people navigate a country that still has dangerous spaces. Some sundown towns have been exposed through viral incidents. A black person is harassed or threatened in a small town. They post about it online. The story spreads. Suddenly, the town's history is being discussed nationally. Sometimes this leads to reflection and change. Sometimes it leads to defensiveness and denial. But it brings the issue out of the shadows. The question of reparations and reconciliation for sundown towns is complex. How do you make amends for decades of exclusion? Some argue for truth and reconciliation processes, where towns formally acknowledge their history, educate residents, and create memorials. Others argue for financial reparations to descendants of expelled residents. Still others focus on present-day policies, affordable housing, fair enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, and active recruitment of diverse residents. What's clear is that simply pretending sundown towns never existed doesn't work. The effects are too visible in current demographics, current wealth gaps, and current inequalities. A full accounting of American racial history has to include sundown towns. It has to include the North as well as the South. It has to include suburbs as well as rural areas. And it has to acknowledge that racial exclusion wasn't just a matter of attitudes or personal prejudice. It was systematic, organized, and often backed by government power. Understanding sundown towns also helps us understand contemporary debates about housing, education, and inequality. When people ask why schools remained segregated decades after Brown versus Board of Education, part of the answer is residential segregation rooted in sundown policies. When people ask why black families have less wealth than white families, part of the answer is exclusion from home ownership in thousands of communities. When people ask why certain neighborhoods are still overwhelmingly white, part of the answer is a history of deliberate exclusion that still shapes choices and opportunities today. The story of sundown towns is uncomfortable. It challenges the narrative of Northern progressivism. It shows that racial oppression wasn't just a Southern problem or a historical relic from the age of slavery. It was a nationwide phenomenon that persisted well into living memory and has ongoing effects. But discomfort isn't a reason to avoid the truth. It's a reason to engage with it more deeply. We need to ask ourselves, what do we owe to the communities that were expelled? What do we owe to the travelers who had to plan every trip around the danger of being in the wrong town after dark? What do we owe to the children who grew up knowing there were whole regions of their own country where they weren't safe? And what do we owe to each other now as we try to build a more just society on the foundation of this history? Sundown towns are a reminder that racial inequality in America isn't accidental. It's not the result of individual prejudices or unfortunate coincidences. It's the result of deliberate policies, systematic exclusion, and organized violence. And it's the result of white communities choosing again and again to exclude black people rather than live alongside them as equals. The signs are mostly gone now. The laws have been repealed, but the geography remains, the demographics remain, the memories remain. And until we fully reckon with what happened, until we acknowledge the scope and the scale and the damage, we can't truly move forward. Sundown towns aren't just history. They're a map of how we got here. And understanding that map is essential to finding a way forward. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.